We as a country, and particularly as a finance community, seem to be completely unable to stop talking about the Federal Reserve and what they're going to do next. And there's pretty good reason for this. First and foremost, because they have an enormous impact on the entire global economy. But also, despite years of trying, they've been unable to achieve their stated goal. And that goal is the Fed wants inflation to go down, ideally to their target of about 2% year over year, while maintaining as much employment as possible. They're trying to achieve what some people have dubbed a soft landing, which basically just means getting inflation under control without going into a recession. Other people think that's impossible and think the Fed is destined for what's known as a hard landing, which would be inflation coming under control, but with a recession at the same time. But there are other options too. I think the worst possible outcome is something called stagflation, which is a recession, but it doesn't even get inflation under control. So basically, you get the worst of both worlds. As of right now, we don't really know which of these three scenarios is going to come true. I'd call the period we're in right now something like a no landing. Like the plane, this analogy they keep using about the economy that we need to land the plane. We have not landed. We are still flying right now and still dealing with all of these macroeconomic factors that came from the pandemic and are still impacting the whole entire country. Right now, inflation is still high, so we can't say there's a soft landing or a hard landing. And although there is no official recession because GDP is still growing, we haven't seen stagflation because without an official recession, that can't at least officially be declared. And before you ask, when I say that GDP is still growing and there's no recession, that is because the way the government tracks the economy, and yes, adjusted for inflation, the economy is still growing. That's the way they do it. And it is growing at 1.3% as of Q1 2024, which, by the way, if you're wondering, that's not great growth, 1.3%. It's pretty low. And I'll put up a chart here. And as you can see, it's trending downward. But at least by official standards, we're not in a recession. And this puts the Fed into a bind because ideally they'd like to lower interest rates right now to stimulate more GDP growth. 1.3%, not so great, but inflation is too high for them to do that. So we're in this no landing situation right now, waiting to see what will happen. Is it going to be a soft landing, a hard landing, more inflation, stagflation? We don't know. And there are a lot of variables that will impact the outcome, but today I want to talk about one, if not the most important variable that's going to impact this question over the next year or so, and that's housing. And I'm going to explain why housing is so important to inflation and the whole Fed picture in just a minute. But first, I want you to meet my friend Dave. Dave literally wrote the book on real estate note investing for BiggerPockets, and his company, PPR Capital Management, wants you to be part of their real estate investment fund. There are no tenants, there's no maintenance or property managers, just headache-free cash flow. Dave and his team at PPR invest in mortgage notes and commercial real estate nationwide. And since 2007, Dave's team has never missed a passive monthly income payment. So if you're looking for cash flow, accredited investors can get started at investwithppr.com. All right, let's get back to where we left off, which was talking about why housing is so important to inflation, the Fed, rate cuts, basically the entire economy. When you dig into inflation data, maybe you haven't done this, I wouldn't blame you, but when you look at inflation data, usually you see some headline numbers like inflation was up 3.6%, or core CPI, the consumer price index, another word for how we measure inflation in this country, or one of the ways we measure inflation in this country, might be up 3.4% over the last year, or something like that. But you can actually dig deeper into these numbers and see what specific sectors of the economy are driving up inflation. And so I'll throw up the chart here and show you guys one of the summaries. This is kind of a rolled up summary of what is driving inflation. And as you can see, if you look at shelter, that's what they call housing. So if you look at shelter, it's actually the highest out of every single category except transportation services, which is at an absolutely insane 11.2% still at this point in 2024. But I'm going to throw up another chart here. And if you look at it, you'll see that this top line inflation number that you hear about doesn't just have different categories, but it actually has different weightings. Like when you see this 3.6 number, it's not just an equal average of all those categories I just showed you. Some of them count for more. So if you look at these things combined, that shelter is one of the highest categories for inflation, and shelter is weighted so heavily in the big picture goal, then it makes sense that the Fed really needs shelter inflation to come under control for them to achieve their targets and then ultimately for them to cut rates. The question is, will that actually happen? There are actually two things that the government tracks that make up this shelter inflation number. The first is rent, which makes sense. The second is something that is called owner's equivalent rent, which is basically what it would cost a homeowner to rent out the equivalent of their own home if they didn't actually own it. And I know it's a very weird system. It doesn't really make sense to me, especially since home ownership rate in the US is 66%, but we're using an equivalent rent. I don't know, but this is the system they use, not up for me to decide. So if you look at this chart, there's two charts. Blue is the owner's equivalent rent. Red is rent. You can see that they're relatively similar. They both peaked back in 2023 and have been trending downwards, but they're still way too high. Most recent reading has them at 5.5%. But if we go even one layer deeper into this government way of tracking data, there is another very strange thing about rent data, and it's well known that this data lags like crazy. So like the data that we're looking at for April or May of 2024 actually reflects trends that were going on basically a year before, back in about 2023, sometime in early 2023, most likely. And this is due to this complicated methodology that they use, but it's also just due to the fact that rents mostly change annually because leases only change once a year. Typical lease is 12 months. So to know how much a single household's rent went up, you basically need to wait a year to see how much their lease changes, right? So that's the reality. But luckily, we have other sources of data and information we can look at, which are private sector rent data. There are tons of different sources out there that do this, like Zillow or Rent.com or Zumper. We even have some at BiggerPockets, and they all use their own methodology. But I'll just show you a couple of them so you can see that for most of them, the trends are basically the same. So the first one I will show you on Rent.com, which uses this concept of asking rent, which is basically, what gets posted on apartments.com or Zillow or whatever, because it's really hard to know what's on the actual lease. You only really know from these listing platforms what the landlord is asking for. Anyway, what you can see is that growth in asking rents actually peaked back in March of 2022. So that is a lot longer ago, because remember what we were talking about when the government data peaked? Well, it was exactly 1 year later in March of 2023. So you see what I mean when I say the government data lags. They just do it a different way. It's not necessarily right or wrong, but it's just older data and isn't really reflecting what has changed in the last year. When we look at other data sources, we see something similar, that rents have come down quite a lot. I'll just show you another source here, which is Zumper. They actually show data peaking a little bit later in 2023, but you've seen that according to yet another source, rent growth has come down to about 0 and actually went negative for some time. And this is the thing that we've seen consistently across every single private sector data source I've seen, whether it's Zumper, Rent.com, Apartments.com, Zillow, Rent Cafe, all of them show that rents have been flat to actually negative in some areas for the last year or so. So that means, at least to me, because we have this lag, but all the private sector data shows that rents are pretty flat, that there is a good chance that over the course of 2024, the way the government measures rent is going to keep declining, at least throughout the year. So that's sort of how I read the data. But the question is, what does this actually mean? Well, to me, at least, this is encouraging, but only mildly so. I think my basic read of the situation is they think there's a good chance shelter inflation comes down close to the Fed's 2% target by the end of the year, just based on what I showed you guys. And this does matter a lot, because remember how much shelter accounts for the total inflation number, and the Fed is looking at that total 2% inflation number. But reality is, it's hard to get too excited about this because inflation over the last few years has really just been this game of whack-a-mole, right? One category shoots up and then it comes back down to earth. But while it's coming back down to earth, another category shoots up. And we've sort of been in this situation where we're rolling through intense bouts of inflation in different segments. Not all of them are up at the same time anymore. Luckily, we are past that. But there's no saying that inflation might not, reignite in some other area of the economy. So while the rent trend is positive and there are reasons for optimism, inflation getting near 2% on the grand scale, the total top line CPI in 2024 is very far from a certain thing. And if I personally had to guess, I'd say that inflation will still be above 2% by the end of the year. That's my personal reading of the situation, but we just don't know. Now, the question becomes, especially for real estate investors or anyone who wants to buy a house, does that mean the Fed won't cut rates? Well, I don't think so. See, they've said that a lot about this 2% target. There's a whole story about the 2% target. It was basically made up out of nowhere. But I don't know if they'll necessarily wait to get there before they cut the federal funds rate. Instead, they've indicated that if GDP continues to decline, and remember, it is still positive, real GDP is still up, but it is declining each quarter that we've seen for the last 3 quarters at least. If it continues to falter, but inflation starts to get on the right trajectory, like it's heading towards 2%, even if they're not there yet, then they will probably cut rates. And that's not just my reading of it. They've basically indicated this in their press conferences that all the financial analysts and nerds like myself obsess over, but that is what they have indicated. If that happens, I don't personally expect it to be some big cut. I don't think we're going to see mortgage rates really start to drop that much. And even if they do cut rates, the fight against inflation and avoiding a recession will almost certainly extend into 2025, meaning we may, unfortunately, stay in this no landing zone for the foreseeable future. We don't know if we're going to have a soft landing, a hard landing, or stagflation, but we're going to have to keep an eye on these really important trends to see where we end up. I'll make sure to update you all on the state of the economy, inflation, everything that's going on regularly on this channel, so make sure to subscribe if you like this type of information. For BiggerPockets, I'm Dave Meyer. Thanks for watching.